That was the love of Thomas Calloway. And like so many quiet, faithful things in this world, it was taken for granted until it was already gone. Thomas was 27 when he married Elise Hartley in a small church outside of Columbus, Ohio, on a Saturday in late September, when the maples had gone red and gold and the air carried that particular edge that means summer has finally accepted its exit. They had met 3 years earlier through mutual friends, a group dinner that had turned into a long walk afterward through the short north, just the two of them, talking the way people talk when they recognize each other. Elise had been partially sighted since her early teens, the result of a progressive macular degeneration that had gradually narrowed and dimmed her world over nearly a decade. By the time she stood at that altar with Thomas, she could perceive light and shadow, color in broad strokes, the silhouette of his face without its details. The world she lived in was impressionistic, shapes rather than edges, warmth rather than precision. Several people had offered Thomas their quiet concerns before the wedding. His father, a pragmatic man who expressed love through caution, had taken him out to the driveway one evening and said, carefully, that marriage was hard enough under the best circumstances. His college roommate had made a joke that wasn't quite a joke. Thomas had listened to all of it with the patience of someone who has already made up his mind. He was not marrying Elise out of nobility or a savior's impulse. He was extremely clear about this, even to himself. He married her because she was the most interesting person he had ever sat across from, because she laughed at exactly the right moments, because she had a way of listening that made you feel your words actually mattered, because she was, in every way he could identify, more fully alive than anyone else in his orbit. The early years of their marriage had a careful structure to them, a choreography they developed together without ever quite naming it. Thomas learned to describe things not just functionally, but vividly. He would sit beside her on the back porch of their house in Worthington and narrate the evening sky as though dictating a telegram to someone in another country. "The clouds are doing something dramatic tonight," he'd say. "Orange piling up on purple. The whole west side looks like it's on fire." Elise would tilt her face in that direction, absorbing his words, filling in what her eyes could only approximate with what his description made real. He reorganized every room in their house so that every object occupied a fixed, reliable position. He never moved a piece of furniture without telling her. He installed additional lighting throughout, not because she needed brightness to see better, but because the variations of light and shadow helped her navigate by contrast, helped her distinguish where one space ended and another began. He drove her to the elementary school, where she taught third grade 5 days a week for 6 years, arriving early enough that she could walk the familiar path from the parking lot to her classroom without the chaos of arriving students making it an obstacle course. Her students adored her. Parents sometimes asked the school administration privately whether it was appropriate, whether a visually impaired teacher could truly supervise a classroom of 8-year-olds. Every year the test scores and the end-of-year letters answered the question without requiring anyone to argue it. Elise taught her students to read not just words, but tones of voice, intentions behind language, the texture of a story. She read aloud to them from memory because she knew the books by heart, and the intimacy of that, a teacher who knew stories well enough to carry them inside herself, made the reading feel different, more alive, like she was giving them something from her own body rather than a page. Behind that confidence, invisible to almost everyone, was Thomas, his daily labor, his presence, the countless small recalibrations he made without keeping score or demanding acknowledgement. He was a structural engineer by profession, and there was something characteristic in how he approached their life together, assessing load-bearing points, anticipating failures before they occurred, building redundancy into systems so that the whole would hold, even when individual pieces shifted. He was not without his own private fears. He lay awake some nights running through contingencies, the way a pilot rehearses emergencies, not from anxiety exactly, but from the specific vigilance of loving someone who is vulnerable in a world designed for people who can see. He never spoke about these fears to Elise, not because he was protecting her from them, but because they were his to carry, and he was the kind of man who did not put down what he had picked up. It was in the 8th year of their marriage that a colleague of Elise's sister mentioned a doctor. Dr. Philip Hartman was a retinal specialist at the Cleveland Clinic who had been following a particular line of experimental research with the quiet intensity of someone who understands that medical breakthroughs tend to arrive slowly and then all at once. He had spoken at a conference about a surgical intervention, a combination of gene therapy and retinal reconstruction, that had shown meaningful results in a narrow category of patients whose macular degeneration fit a specific profile. Elise's condition, when he reviewed her history, fit that profile with an unusual precision. He met with them on a Tuesday in February, the Ohio sky, the particular flat gray of deep winter, and he was careful from the first sentence. "I want to be precise with you," he said, "because hope can be a dangerous thing when it isn't properly calibrated." He gave them the numbers. Roughly 60% of patients in comparable trials had experienced what he called meaningful visual restoration. Not perfect vision, not the vision of someone who had never lost it, but functional vision. Faces, text, the details of the world. For a subset of those patients, the restoration had been, in his measured language, extraordinary. For others, it had been modest. For a portion, there had been no change. And for a smaller portion, complications, Thomas said. Yes. They drove back to Columbus through the grey afternoon without speaking much. Elise sat with her hands in her lap, not turned toward the window as she sometimes was, quiet in a way that Thomas recognized as serious thinking rather than sadness. He did not intrude on it. He had learned over 8 years the difference between the quiet that needed company and the quiet that needed space. That night she said, "I want to try." He said, "Then we'll try." The surgery cost more than their savings. It cost more than a second mortgage would comfortably cover without restructuring their finances entirely. Thomas's firm offered a partial advance on a bonus that wouldn't officially arrive until year-end. He cashed out a retirement account and absorbed the penalty. He sold a vintage truck he'd been restoring in the garage for 4 years, a 1969 Ford F-100 that he had never quite finished and had always vaguely intended to. He did not mention these transactions to Elise in a way that framed them as sacrifices. They were simply what needed to happen, and so they happened. And he moved on to the next thing that needed to happen. The surgery was on a Thursday in March. Thomas sat in a waiting room at Cleveland Clinic for 7 hours. He bought a terrible sandwich from a vending machine and ate half of it. He called his father once and said very little. He sat with his hands laced together and looked at the floor, and did not think about much of anything, which was its own kind of discipline. When Dr. Hartman came through the doors and said it had gone well, Thomas sat completely still for a long moment. Then he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, not crying, not yet, but doing something, releasing some pressure that had been building in him for longer than the day, longer than the surgery, longer than he could accurately trace. Recovery unfolded over weeks and months, cautious and non-linear. Bandages came off in stages. Light was introduced slowly. Elise's visual cortex, long accustomed to filling gaps with inference, had to learn to receive what was actually there rather than what it had been constructing. Her first clear perception was of Thomas's face. She had known his face for 8 years through touch, the jaw that went sharp at the corners, the slight unevenness of his nose from a break in high school, the texture of his stubble at various stages of the week. She had her own complete and private portrait of him, assembled from 1,000 points of contact. Now she looked at it. She was quiet for a long time. "You have grey in your hair," she said finally. "Here." She touched his temple. "I didn't know that." "It's been there since about year 3, he said. "You should have told me." "You never asked." She laughed at that, the startled, helpless laugh that meant something had gotten past her defenses. He memorized the way her face looked when she laughed, seeing it now with his own eyes rather than imagining it from its sound, and found that it matched perfectly. Over the months that followed, her vision continued to sharpen. Not without limitations. There was a persistent sensitivity to direct light, a slight softness at the periphery, some difficulty tracking fast movement. But she could read. She could see the faces of her students. She could look out a window and see, not the smeared impressionist suggestion she had known for 15 years, but the actual individual leaves on the actual individual oak tree in their yard. The world had resolution. It had texture. It had the innumerable small details that sighted people absorb without noticing, and that Elise now catalogued with a ferocious, grateful attention. She wept often in those first months. She wept at sunrises. She wept in grocery stores, stopped in an aisle, looking at the sheer visual abundance of it. She wept driving home from a parent-teacher conference because the streetlights on I-270 were arranged in a pattern she found unexpectedly, irrationally beautiful. Thomas drove her a lot those early months, not because she needed him to, but because they both liked having the time together, watching her discover things. And then something shifted. It was subtle at first, the way most consequential changes are. With vision came a kind of personal recalibration. Elise had built her identity around interiority, her listening, her memory, her language, her self-possession. She had been someone who moved through the world from the inside out. Now she had an exterior that was fully visible to her, and she discovered, in the frank light of her own renewed sight, that she was beautiful in a way she had kept at careful arm's length for years. Uncertain of what people saw when they looked at her, uncertain whether the compliments were honest or were the specific, softened flattery that people extend to those they feel they must protect. She quit teaching after the second year post-surgery. Not abruptly. She finished the school year and did not renew her contract. She had been approached about developing an educational consulting practice, something broader and higher profile, something that would require travel and visibility and the kind of professional identity that her classroom had never quite offered. She took it. Thomas was glad for her. He said so genuinely. She began traveling to conferences. She made new professional contacts in cities she had never navigated alone before. She came home with the particular energy of someone whose world has expanded rapidly and is moving fast to fill it. Thomas watched this with something he chose to identify as gladness and tried to hold on to that identification. The man's name was Griffin. Griffin Mercer was a communications consultant. She met at an education summit in Chicago. Tan, magnetic in the practiced way of people who make a living being persuasive, skilled at the particular attentiveness that reads as connection when you first encounter it. He and Elise began corresponding about professional things that gradually became personal things. Thomas noticed the phone first, the way she angled it. Then the way she smiled at distances, looking at nothing he could identify. He asked her once at dinner quietly. She said there was nothing to ask about. He tried to believe her because he was not a suspicious man, and because the alternative was a place he was not ready to go. He found out the way people find out, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a small, ordinary accident. A notification on a laptop screen she'd left open on the kitchen counter. A message from a name he didn't recognize. 3 sentences long, unmistakable in their register and their warmth and where they were directed. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. When she came home, he was sitting at the table. The same table they'd moved into this house 9 years ago, positioned exactly where he'd placed it the day they moved in. 3 feet from the window, parallel to the wall, in the spot that gave her the most light and the most clearance. He had never moved it. He looked at her, come through the door, and saw the exact moment she understood. "I need you to be honest with me," he said. She sat down. The silence lasted long enough to contain several things at once. Then she told him the truth, the plain, unlayered version, and it was the plainness of it that hurt most. Not spectacle, not passionate crisis. She had met someone. She had feelings she couldn't explain. She had kept it from him because she didn't know what she wanted and had been hoping the uncertainty would resolve itself without requiring her to say anything out loud. Thomas asked her one question. "Do you think this would have happened before the surgery?" She looked at him for a long time. "I don't know," she said. "The world is different now. I'm different. I feel like I've been meeting myself for the first time, and She stopped. "I don't want to destroy you." "But you already have," he said, not with anger, with the precision of a man identifying a structural failure. He moved out within the month. He took what was practically his clothes, tools, the books that were specifically his. He left her the house because it was organized around her, and reorganizing it would take time she didn't have. He spoke to a lawyer without emotion. When people asked, he said they had grown apart, which was both factually accurate and almost meaninglessly incomplete. He did not hate her. He had prepared himself, in the dark spaces of those early weeks, to feel hatred, and its absence surprised him. What he felt instead was grief, the specific, objectless grief of someone who has lost not a person, but a version of their own life that no longer exists. Grief has nothing to push against. It just sits inside you and asks to be absorbed. He moved to Nashville, where his firm had an office. He had been offered a position there 2 years earlier, and had declined it without telling Elise he had even been asked. He accepted it now. He found a clean, bare apartment in East Nashville, furnished it over several weekends, and began what he thought of as the reconstruction. Healing, Thomas discovered, was not a single event or a decision or a moment of clarity. It was an accumulation of ordinary days. It was going to a new barber shop and finding a barber he liked. It was cooking for himself and discovering gradually that he enjoyed the kitchen in a way he never had when it was a utility rather than a pleasure. It was calling his father on Sunday afternoons and having conversations that were, for the first time in his adult life, fully unguarded. He ran. He had never been a runner, but he became one. Early mornings along the Cumberland River Greenway, the city still mostly asleep, just the light on the water and the particular quality of silence that exists between darkness and full day. He found in the rhythm of it something he hadn't been able to locate through any other means. A sense of his own body as something reliable, something that belonged entirely to him. He did not date for nearly 2 years. Not as a monument to the marriage or a punishment to himself, but because he wasn't ready and he had learned, in the years with Elise, to respect the honest assessment of his own state. When he did begin again, he met a woman named Caroline through a colleague at the firm. She was a landscape architect, practical, funny, possessed of a directness that he found genuinely restful after years of learning to read the unspoken. They were friends for nearly a year, carefully, and then there was something more with a naturalness that felt unlike anything he had engineered. He told her about the marriage eventually. She listened without performing sympathy. She said, "Whatever happened to you then made you who you are now. I hope you know that's something." He was not entirely sure he did know it. He was beginning to. Back in Ohio, Elise's life had taken the shape she'd reached for. The consulting practice grew. She and Griffin were visible together for a while, photographed at events, mentioned in professional circles. A story that people found compelling in the way people find compelling anything that can be narrated as a triumph. Elise did not read the coverage. She understood that the narrative being constructed around her was cleaner and simpler than the truth. The relationship with Griffin lasted 3 years. It ended in the specific way that things end when the exciting architecture of early feeling gives way to the structural reality of 2 people with different foundational values trying to share a life. He wanted to relocate to San Francisco. She did not. He went. She stayed. The parting was civil and left her at 41, living alone in a Columbus apartment with a consulting practice she'd built from scratch and a window that faced east and let in the morning light that she still, 7 years after the surgery, found she could not look at without feeling something complicated. Part 6. The darkness returns. The headaches arrived first. Dull, recurring, easy to attribute to screen time or stress, or the general physical tax of a life lived at speed. Then the visual disturbances, a shimmering at the edges of things, a new difficulty with direct light, a narrowing at the periphery that she told herself was fatigue, and kept telling herself until she could no longer tell herself anything convincing. Dr. Hartman had retired. His successor at the Cleveland Clinic reviewed her imaging with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who understands that what you say in the next 90 seconds will matter to this patient for the rest of their life. The original procedure addressed the most acute deterioration, she explained, but the underlying genetic condition continued progressing at a slower rate. What we're seeing now is consistent with that progression. She paused. The good news, such as it is that the decline is gradual. With aggressive management, medication, lifestyle modification, close monitoring, we can slow it significantly. But the direction is clear. Elise sat in the exam chair and looked at the diplomas on the wall. She looked at the window. She looked at her own hands in her lap. How long? She asked. Years, if you manage it carefully. I can't give you a number with any confidence, but years. She drove home alone and sat in her apartment as the afternoon light moved across the floor. She looked at everything: the grain of the wood on her coffee table, the light on the walls, the view from her east-facing window. She looked at these things with a new attention, the attention of someone who has been given a deadline without a date. She thought about Thomas. Not romantically at first, or not only romantically. She thought about him in the way you think about a place you left without looking back and now cannot return to. She thought about what she had done with the sight he had given her, what she had turned it toward, what she had chosen to look at, and what she had refused to see. The accounting of it was uncomfortable in a way that moved through her whole body, not just her mind. She called people carefully, indirectly. Old mutual friends who might know where he was, how he was. She learned he was in Nashville. She learned he was with someone. She sat with that information for a long time. She understood that what she felt was not the clean, symmetrical pain of loss, but the more complicated, fully deserved pain of having caused it. She flew to Nashville on a Wednesday in October, the same month they had married, though she did not think about that until she was already on the plane. She had composed a message to him twice and deleted it twice. Some things, she had decided, required the full physical weight of arrival. Some things could not be transmitted. He answered the door in a grey t-shirt and work boots, a set of rolled blueprints tucked under one arm. He had been home from the office perhaps 20 minutes. He was greyer at the temples now, more than she had noticed in the years of peripheral glimpses at mutual events they had not quite managed to avoid. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not cold, not warm, something still and careful. The expression of a man who has learned not to react before he understands what he's reacting to. Elise, he said. I know I don't have the right to be here, she said. I'm here anyway, because I've already taken enough from you that I don't want to take the chance to say the things I should have said a long time ago. He stepped back from the door. Not quite an invitation, not a refusal. She sat in his living room and told him everything. Not the softened version. Not the version organized around complexity and circumstance, and the way the surgery had changed her, and how anyone might have struggled to navigate such a sudden expansion of self. She told him the honest version, that she had been selfish in a way she had understood even at the time, that she had taken what he built and turned it toward the first new thing that appeared when her world opened up, that she had known what she was doing and had done it anyway, that the life she had chased had not been worth what she traded for it. That she understood now, with a clarity she wished had come sooner, what kind of man had loved her and what she had done with that love. She told him about the diagnosis. She was deliberate about this, watching his face carefully as she said it, making clear by her tone that she was not presenting it as an appeal. She was not there with her hand out. She was there because she needed him to know that she finally knew, that she finally saw. When she finished, they sat on his back porch in the October air. The yard backed up to a stand of tall maples, the leaves at their peak, orange piling on red, the kind of thing he used to describe to her. I'm with someone, he said. Her name is Caroline. I know. I'm glad. She paused. I hope she knows what she has. He looked at her, directly, fully, the way he had always looked at her, the way she hadn't known how to receive when she had it. He saw that what she was saying was real. He saw the grief in it, and the honesty, and the absence of manipulation. He saw that she was not the woman who had stood in their kitchen in Worthington and told him there was nothing to ask about. I forgave you a long time ago, he said. Not for your sake, for mine. She nodded. She had half expected it, and it still moved through her like something physical. I didn't come here for that, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you. Epilogue. They did not reconcile. That was never the shape this story could take, because some doors, once closed, do not open inward. They open onto something entirely different, something you can only reach by walking away